Thank you for such a kind presentation. It's late, and if you allow, I designed my lecture in two parts. So perhaps I will present only the second part. I'll tell why. In recent years, national identity in post-Soviet Armenia has undergone a profound conceptual shift from an essentialist and static understanding to a dynamic processual mode of self-identification. This transformation echoes Ernest Renan's notion of the nation as a daily plebiscite, emphasizing lived experience over inherited categories. One of the most debated articulations of this reconfigured identity is the notion of the real Armenia, championed by Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his political allies. Central in this vision is his often cited slogan, "Armenia is my home heart and the people are my family." This metaphor of familial belonging, while resonant, raises complex questions about the trajectory from Soviet legacies of collectivism to contemporary models of statehood. The ideology of the real Armenia, according to its proponents, draws its legitimacy from two pivotal movements, the independence movement and the Karabakh movement. That was the reason why I designed my lecture, the first part of my lecture about the Karabakh movement, for it was also a time of a crisis for Armenia and very interesting things, I think, over there. But I think we will stop on the second part of this, if you allow, of course. But I want to mention one note by Nikolaios Adons, who in his prescient 1929 essay, Political Movements in Ancient Armenia, identifies two competing political tendencies, one compliant and loyal, geared toward state consolidation, the other rebellious, echoing feudal structures of resistance. These tendencies, he argued, were foundational to Armenian political culture. We will return to this dual framework later, as it continues to illuminate present configurations. So I'll go through my presentation a little, which is, this is, by the way, how Gorbachev's that is reforms on perestroika, glasnost, and democratization were collapsed by the jester, you see, who is in the national forum. And this one also I want you to see. This is Hakop Hakopian's picture, not a very popular one, about the independence of Armenia, and it's depicting the rallies during the Karabakh movement and the theater square and as a festival. And by the way, he used some of my articles to create this. In Soviet Armenia, Armenianness was largely constructed through the lens of anti-colonial identity. Ethnic self-definition emerged in opposition to Russification, reinforced by historical narratives. With the advent of independence, self-identification took a new dimensions, particularly around the term Ask nation. When modern concepts of nation and nationalism entered Armenian discourse in the 19th century, Armenians adopted the indigenous term Ask, which, like the Latin natio, encompasses meanings such as tribe, clan, people, and class. It was then as it acquired new political meaning, Ask retained its original familial and tribal connotations. Although Ask does not literally mean family, it refers to a traditional kindred group and belongs to the same semantic field. Words like Azganun, family name, and Azgagan, relative, put the concept of Ask back toward kin-based realities. This is not a semantic accident, but a reflection of deeply rooted cultural models. As you see here, in everyday Yerevan speech of the in the beginning of the 90s, a young man might call a peer Abed, brother, or Kujik, sister, while addressing all the strangers as Hopar, father's brother, or Morkur, mother's sister, and elderly men as Maidik, mother, Haidik, father. One will rarely meet a Horkur, father's sister, and Keri, mother's brother. The Armenian terms of kinship include this gender specification for parents, relatives. For example, in Russia, in Moscow, I would not make this investigation, this study, for they don't have these different kinds of addresses. These address patterns model Armenian society, the Ask nation, as an extended family, father, mother, and children, the Hopar, father's brother, and Morkur, mother's sister, presenting representatively an extended father and an extended mother. In this sense, such addressing fits Anthony Smith's description of the non-Western model of nation as a fictive superfamily. If we also add here the Akhbar, brother, used in Armenia to pejoratively denominate repatriates and diaspora Armenians in general, we will have the entire Armenian nation. This kinship paradigm, absent from the abstract Latin-derived term natio, imparts familial nuances in Armenian nationhood. Such a model may explain Armenia's tendency toward a family state in the post-Soviet period. Clan systems pervade all levels of social organization, from households to NGOs, economic collectives, and even the higher levels of government, for example, the President Petrosyan's family. The 1999 parliamentary shooting also exhibited familial logic. The terrorist group had a pronounced family clan nature. It is characteristic that the place of the assassinated Prime Minister Vazgen Sargsyan was shortly occupied by his brother, and Karen Demircan's son soon became the leader of the party which had been headed by his murdered father. In this context, Armenian individualism often manifests as familial individualism. One represents not oneself but one's family. The Armenian word for family, Antonic, derives from Antoni, one of the home, containing the root tun, home. This signifies that family means those at home. Tun itself refers not only to a house but also to its inhabitants, clan, and metaphorically in the nation or cosmos, to the nation or cosmos. Etymological evidence, you can see it in Acharan's dictionary, affirms that home and family are central to Armenian identity. Tun can even mean a world or country in a cosmological sense. Hence, the Armenian nation state is not only a family state but also a home state. During times of crisis, when the state failed to meet citizens' basic needs, many survived through kinship art networks, particularly via support from newly emigrated relatives. This familial capillary lifeline, though less visible than large-scale diaspora philanthropy, sustained everyday survival. One might say that Ask family preserved the Ask nation and kept its home intact. It remains unclear why this familial model became prominent after the Soviet period's historical identity projects. Yet, as I have argued elsewhere, already in the 5th century in Armenia, a community comparable to a modern nation appeared as a byproduct of the reforms of the early medieval constructors. So I don't know why this family-oriented thing appeared. These family and home-oriented patterns may indicate a grassroots orientation, especially in a monoethnic society, more than 98%, like Armenia, which could serve as a platform for top-down nation building. As Eric Hobsbawm noted, invented traditions succeed only when they are not rejected by the population. Even if an extended family model prevailed in the early post-Soviet era, should the state be built on this foundation? Recall how Stolypin dismantled Russia's archaic rural communities in the name of modernization. Yet this seems to be Prime Minister Pashinyan's current project, to build a nation-state around the ideals of family and home. This concept is most likely connected to reassessments of the 2018 the Velvet Revolution he organized. Pashinyan may have drawn inspiration from Vartan Azajan's book, Who Made the Revolution, published in 2019, which highlights the role of families in protest mobilizations. Pashinyan somewhat simplifies this. In his telling, it was teenagers who initiated the revolution, prompting their parents to join in order to protect them. At least twice I heard him saying this. As in the folk tale of the giant turnip, but reversed, the family becomes the root of revolution. Azajan, however, is far from celebratory about this model, while his book gathers diverse sources that show the family's role in Armenian society. It was not intended as a manifesto for our family-based nation building. Ultimately, the family as a societal model is problematic. It invokes an archaic patriarchal structure while advocating for a modern nation state. In terms of add-ons that I brought in the beginning. Binary model, it forms a contradictory unity between feudal and statist logic. Philosopher Ashot Boskanyan has rightly warned that modeling the nation on the family risks authoritarianism and stunting of civil society. In one of the morning panels, Georg Borusan showed and illustrated that his concerns are supported by Welzer and Engelhardt's shifting values map. The concept of the real Armenia, as prompted by Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his administration, centers around the idea of a state demarcated by internationally recognized and territorially bounded borders. In this framework, the loss of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh is reframed not as a tragedy or defeat, but as a form of liberation from a burdensome and problematic territory. Similarly, the real Armenia distances itself from the Armenian diaspora, symbolically severing ties with those who lack physical presence or territorial attachment to the republic. The disconnection, however, operates asymmetrically, while the territorial separation of Artsakh was extremely enforced by Azerbaijan. The distancing from the diaspora is enacted by the Republic of Armenia itself. German anthropologist Jürgen Gisbert has noted the symbolic significance of this shift. In 2022, Armenian ambassador in the US, Lilith Makuns, commemorated the Genocide Memorial Day not with the diaspora community in Washington's memorial site, but within the confines of the Armenian embassy, thus within Armenian territory. The signal was clear. The real Armenia defines its constituency territorially, reducing the diaspora ties to a one-way relationship in which financial contributions and political lobbying are expected, but mutual recognition and symbolic reciprocity are withheld. This marks a decisive break from the rhetoric of global Armenian unity that defined the Karabakh movement of the late 80s. What was once considered a unique asset, Armenia's transnational demographic advantage, with the diaspora outnumbering the local population more than threefold, is now treated as a liability, perhaps due to the state's inability to manage or control it. As Ashot Voskanyan recently recalled, the note of Alexander Myasnikyan, we are not the government of all Armenians. And yet, whereas Myasnikyan was grappling with a Soviet, non-Soviet Armenian divide, Pashinyan appears to be addressing a deeper tension between place-bound loyalty and extraterritorial identity. The dilemma of how to manage the diaspora has long haunted Armenian statecraft. At the first Armenia Diaspora Forum, President Levon Petrosyan famously remarked that he could only engage with the diaspora if it were represented by a single individual. lamenting the fact that every well-meaning benefactor claimed to speak on behalf of the diaspora. Efforts to create an official collective diaspora body failed. Later, at a similar forum, Prime Minister Vazgen Sargsyan called for direct individual engagement. Those wishing to help Armenia should speak to him personally. This model too was disrupted tragically by Sargsyan's assassination in the 1999 parliamentary attack. The Ministry of the Diaspora, despite noble aims, functions largely through ad hoc project-based connections. More visionary models, such as the early 1990s plan by Minister of State, the late Grigor Areshan, who was also your professor in your university, remained unrealized. Areshan proposed a global tiered system of Armenian expertise and consultation, a strategic institute led by a director and academic secretary, drawing from disciplinary councils composed of elite Armenian specialists. Local experts would consult colleagues from the former Soviet diaspora, who would then engage Western Armenian professionals and their networks. A global Armenian brain trust anchored by a central database was envisioned, but this model too never came to fruition. The real Armenia also involves a symbolic erasure of extraterritorial national references. Mount Ararat seems to be suggested as a replacement for Mount Ararat in the national coat of arms, along with the removal of heraldic animals no longer linked to the current territorial state. The program of selective forgetting extends to historical traumas as well. In contrast, during the Karabakh movement, genocide-related posters and slogans significantly outnumbered those referencing Karabakh itself. The implication is that real Armenia is contrasted through loyalty to a depoliticized state minority memory, and following Nikolaios Adon's dual schema through forgetfulness as a mode of submission. Having territorially disengaged from the intractable Karabakh issue and symbolically distanced itself from its ambiguous non-material presence of the diaspora, the real Armenia emerges as a purified territorial core. This newly defined statehood is envisioned as surrounded by neighbors who, in the vision of the Pan-Armenian national movement, could shift roles from eternal enemies to potential friends, and vice versa. In Pashinyan's framework, Armenia must cultivate at least functional, if not amicable, relations with all its neighbors. Within this model, real Armenia is to become a crossroads of peace, a hub for regional integration marked by an open network of highways and railways accessible to all. Here are the plans of this. This brings us to a long-standing issue in Armenian self-identification. Culturally and geographically, who are we, Europeans or Asians? Are we heirs of Western or Eastern civilization? Given the absence of a clearly defined natural boundary between Europe and Asia, Various geographic models draw the continental border differently. It usually cuts across the space between the Black and Caspian Seas, following either the Central Caucasian Ridge or the Guru-Manich Depression. In most versions, Transcaucasia, including Armenia, is located in Asia. Yet, in some classifications, for example, in the 1952 the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, Transcaucasia is placed within Europe, thereby shifting Armenia into the European sphere. But beyond geographical criteria, Armenia's alignment with Europe is affirmed in functional and institutional terms. The country is a member of the European Soccer League, participates in Eurovision, and is admitted to the Council of Europe, though with the conditional caveat that it must behave like a European, that is, as a civilized nation state. This external pressure is mirrored by internal conviction. Many Armenians already consider themselves culturally European. However, this self-perception appears to be typical of communities living near geopolitical boundaries. Turkey aspires to join the European Union. Georgians, after discovering ancient hominid remains interpreted as Proto-Europeans, sometimes lay claim to Paleo-European ancestry, even as the geographical orientation shifts eastward toward Russia recently. Meanwhile, Armenia also exhibits a strong semiotic affinity with Asia. For instance, the first Western-style market in Yerevan, primarily composed of small vendors, functioned more like a traditional Asian bazaar. Western consumer goods entered not through Western retail chains, but via Easternized market networks. The musical landscape reflects similar hybridity. While part of the population aligns with European musical tastes, the dominant aesthetic is Rabbi's, a genre blending Oriental and Western elements. Rabbi's, jazz, flamenco, and other such syncretic styles exemplify Armenia's cultural liminality. This ambivalence reflects more than a geopolitical dilemma. It reveals a semiotic condition. Armenia imagines itself as a space of civilizational in-betweenness. An illustrative example comes from a brainstorming and sociological study conducted in Yerevan in the fall of 1990. The aim was to identify a location for a new city, Europolis, which was planned after the 1988 earthquake but never built. The majority of respondents proposed the village of Yerazkhavan in the Ararat Valley, a site adjacent to Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan. The symbolic logic was clear. Armenia, as imagined by its citizens, is a pivot between civilizational spheres. In the late Soviet period, nearly all democratic and so-called people's movements in the Soviet republics located along the USSR's borders declared their readiness to become intermediaries between Europe and Asia, regardless of their actual geographic proximity to Europe. Central Asian republics made such claims too. Armenia, however, unlike most of these republics, had historically occupied such an intermediary role for centuries, sometimes to its advantage, other times to its detriment. In the post-Soviet period, positioned between Russia, Asia, and Europe, Armenia has been compelled to choose between these orientations. Its current leadership has opted for closer ties with the European Union while attempting to remain within the Eurasian Customs Union, a dual alignment many Russian experts deem technically unfeasible. This is where the alternative of being in between the crossroads of peace emerges. Despite support from many countries, this revival of an old model of mediation remains far from realization, especially nowadays with this difficult political situation just in this region. However, another model of mediation may be viable. One grounded in the very diaspora that the real Armenia has seemingly cast aside. The contemporary Asia-Europe dilemma follows a longer-standing East-West divide. Unlike the fluctuating Asia-Europe border, which changes its geographical and political imaginations, the East-West border is far more mobile and historically contingent. As shifted westward with the Seljuk expansions, placing the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, that is in the 12th and 14th centuries, squarely on that line far from the Armenian ethnic territory. In Russo-Oriental relations, the East-West axis corresponded to the South-North route through the Caucasus. In these zones, Circassian Armenians with a distinctive history served as intermediaries between southern, eastern, and northern, western societies. The destruction of Jura in the early 17th century offers another example. Thriving Armenian trade center in a thriving Armenian trade center in the 16th century, Jura was raised by Shah Abbas of Persia in order to move the east-west border towards his domain. Its population was forcibly relocated to Persia, where they founded New Jura, another intermediary hub. 2 centuries later, when the east-west divide extended to India, Armenian merchants from New Jura had already established networks there. And played a crucial role in assisting the British East India Company in its initial expansion. This shows that where this east-west boundary goes now to India. In 1688, Armenians in India were granted rights equal to those of British nationals, a privilege that was later revoked in the early 1760s, after some of them, particularly the legendary Armenian commander-in-chief of the Bengal army, Gergin Khan, sided with rebel forces against the company. This is Gergin Khan. These and other examples, despite their different historical trajectories, from forced migrations to bold trade expeditions, share a structural pattern. Wherever the east-west border shifts, Armenians somehow appear at the crossing point, as if destined to mediate between opposing civilizations. Sometimes involuntarily, sometimes by design, Armenians find themselves in this liminal role, a dynamic echoed today in Armenia's ambiguous positioning under the crossroads of peace concept. Local cases affirm this broader pattern. In Cyprus, for instance, Armenians fleeing the Ottoman genocide initially settled among local Turks, becoming intermediaries between Turkish and British interests. Following the Greek-Turkish divide, they had to relocate again, this time to the Greek side of the island. This microcosm illustrates both the strategic utility and the precarity of the intermediary role. Indeed, the in-between position is not without cost. It has led to profound vulnerabilities, especially when the East and the West have entered into conflict. Armenia's historical position between warring blocs has repeatedly made it a victim. This pattern of in-between position is also reflected in the formation of the diaspora itself. The partition of Armenia between Persia and Byzantium in 386 set the stage for a long history of displacement. Today, with international air travel having replaced old caravan routes, it is tempting to ask whether new forms of mediation can be developed for a globalized world. Notably, the East-West line seems poised to shift again. In the mystical logic of this recurring pattern, the best indicator of the new civilizational borderline may be the location of large Armenian communities. At the end of the 20th century, that place was California. Of approximately 1.5 million Armenians in the United States, nearly 80% reside in California. The growing Asian population in the state, including students and scholars at institutions like UC Berkeley, provides further evidence of this possible shift. Since the 1980s, U.S. trade has increasingly pivoted from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, reinforcing California's role as a new East-West contact zone. In this emerging geography, Armenians once again find themselves, perhaps inevitably, at the crossroads. Yet it is unlikely that the shifting East-West border will remain anchored in Western North America for long. A new shift may already be underway, and if our metaphorical litmus test, the presence of concentrated Armenian communities, is any indication, the next locus may be Russia. In 2002, official estimates put the number of Armenians in Russia at around 1.13 million, with unofficial figures ranging from 1.5 to 2 million. During his 2015 visit to Armenia, Vladimir Putin referenced a figure of 3 million. Given the current political instability in the region, it is difficult to predict whether the civilizational borderline is truly migrating. It is possible, however, that the diffuse distribution of Armenians across the territory could signal a new kind of East-West threshold. Even if this interpretive framework does not always operate with scientific precision, it offers an alternative paradigm, one in which Armenia finds itself again and again near or at the center of civilizational boundaries. This scenario becomes plausible if meaningful strategic ties are developed with the diaspora, particularly those located along these transitional frontiers. One might argue that such a strategy is speculative or unscientific. To that, we might recall a famous anecdote. When a friend saw a horseshoe hanging above Niels Bohr's door and asked if he really believed in such superstitions, Bohr allegedly replied, "They say it works even if you don't believe in it." Indeed, even the failures and disruptions in diaspora relations may serve as starting points for deeper engagement. Ideally, Armenia should foster connections with all segments of the diaspora, reviving initiatives like those envisioned by Grigor Arasyan. A more systematic and less episodic approach could transform the Ministry of Diaspora's activities into a coherent global strategy. If successful, Armenia could become a more accurate and networked reflection of itself. Even when the crossroads strategy stalls, Armenia can remain stunned to global dynamics while maintaining a classical diaspora logical link. That's according to Safran and other classics of diaspora studies. Albeit in reverse, not from diaspora to homeland, as is in definitions of all that's classical diasporas, but from homeland to diaspora. In this way, the impaired real Armenia might yet transform into a truly networked and substantially more real Armenia.